I went looking for the origin of the word taxi in Soviet armor doctrine and found something more interesting than a nickname. The term appears as the gun. The M242 Bushmaster wasn't designed to suppress. It was designed to kill light armor at range with ammunition that didn't care about Soviet reactive armor packages or spaced armor configurations. The Soviets knew this technically. Their intelligence reports detailed the weapon system. But doctrine moves slower than engineering, and the field manuals that Soviet officers carried into Iraq in the late 1980s, the manuals that trained Iraqi Republican Guard crews, still emphasized the Bradley as a support vehicle vulnerable to BMP cannons in direct engagement. I found references in multiple translated manuals, and in one CIA intelligence assessment from 1987 that mentions Soviet instructor materials using the term. The original Russian text, Iraqi BMP crews trained on Soviet doctrine using Soviet vehicles, following Soviet tactical deployment patterns, treated Bradleys like peer threats instead of superior threats. They engaged at ranges where the 25mm Bushmaster had overwhelming advantage. February 26th, during the breach of the Iraqi defense line. That's one data point. There were others. The cumulative total from Desert Storm sits somewhere north of 100 BMP kills credited to Bradleys, but the actual number depends on which report you trust and how you count shared kills and mobility kills versus catastrophic kills. Soviet military analysts obtained these after-action reports. How they got them? Intelligence channels, diplomatic access, leaked documents, I don't know. But Russian military publications from 1992 and 1993 reference Desert Storm Bradley performance in threat reassessments of NATO armored vehicles. The taxi classification disappeared from some documents, not all. Tank destroyer, air defense platform. Every branch had requirements, and those requirements conflicted. And the Fighting Vehicle Program, later renamed the Infantry Fighting Vehicle Program, became a case study in how not to develop weapons systems. The original specification from 1972 called for a vehicle that could swim across rivers, carry 11 infantrymen, survive artillery fragments, keep pace with M1 Abrams tanks, mount a cannon capable of defeating Soviet BMPs, carry anti-tank missiles, weigh less than 25 tons for air transport, and cost under $500,000 per unit. That was impossible. The engineers knew it was impossible. They submitted designs anyway, because that's what contractors do when the Army publishes requirements. By 1977, the swimming requirement was gone. The troop capacity dropped to 9. The weight limit increased to 33 tons. The cost projection hit $1.5 million per unit. Congress threatened to kill funding. The Army insisted the program was essential. Defense analysts called it a gold-plated disaster. The vehicle that finally entered production in 1981 bore almost no resemblance to the 1972 specification, except for the basic concept of a tracked armored box with a gun. Here's what irritates me about the procurement debate. The critics were right about almost everything. The Bradley was expensive, it was complex, it required extensive maintenance. It couldn't swim anymore. Wouldn't stop Soviet tank rounds. All true. But the one thing the critics missed, the thing that mattered in actual combat, was that 25mm cannon with ammunition that could punch through BMP armor at 2,000 meters. The Bushmaster wasn't part of the original design because theater commanders wanted more M1 Abrams tanks instead. Bradleys were considered support vehicles, useful for reconnaissance and infantry transport, but not essential for the armor-heavy battle plan that General Schwarzkopf's staff was designing. They went anyway because the deployment orders included mechanized infantry units, and those units were equipped with Bradleys. The Iraqi Republican Guard had BMPs, the M791, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot tracer. Round weighs 395 grams. The penetrator itself, the part that does the damage, is a depleted uranium dart, 86 millimeters long and 13 millimeters in diameter, weighing about 150 grams. When the propellant charge ignites, that dart accelerates to roughly 1,100 meters per second. That's 3,600 feet per second. Muzzle velocity. The depleted uranium matters because of density. Uranium is 1.7 times denser than lead. When you concentrate that much mass into a small cross-section, moving at supersonic velocity, the physics get ugly. The penetrator doesn't deform significantly on impact. Steel and aluminum do. The BMP-1 and BMP-2 use aluminum armor on the hull and turret. Aluminum is light. It allows the vehicle to stay mobile with a small engine. But aluminum has roughly one-third the density of steel and significantly lower hardness. What happens is this. The penetrator hits the outer armor plate and punches through. The aluminum doesn't stop it or deflect it. The dart continues through the vehicle interior. If it hits ammunition, the ammunition detonates. If it hits fuel, the fuel ignites. If it hits crew, they die. The penetrator exits through the opposite side of the vehicle in most cases, assuming there's enough kinetic energy remaining. Total transit time through the vehicle is measured in milliseconds. The BMP-2 has slightly better armor than the BMP-1. The front glacis is 33 mm at 78 degrees. The turret front is 23 mm. The side armor is 18 mm. None of that stops a depleted uranium dart moving at 1,100 meters per second. Soviet reactive armor packages, the explosive tiles mounted on later BMP variants, were designed to defeat shaped charge warheads from anti-tank missiles and RPGs. They don't work against kinetic penetrators. The effective engagement range for the M791 against BMP-type targets is approximately 2,500 meters under ideal conditions. Practical combat range sits closer to 2,000 meters because crews need to identify targets and achieve fire control solutions. The BMP-2's 30mm cannon has an effective range against light armor of maybe 1,500 meters. Against heavier targets like the Bradley, that range drops to under 1,000 meters because the 30mm AP round doesn't have enough penetration to reliably defeat the Bradley's spaced aluminum armor and steel plate combination. This creates a problem if you're a BMP crew engaging a Bradley. You're outranged by 500 to 1,000 meters. Your armor won't stop their gun. Their armor might stop yours depending on range and impact angle. Soviet doctrine assumed mutual vulnerability. Both vehicles could kill each other, therefore tactics and positioning determined the outcome. That assumption was wrong. I found a Soviet ballistics study from 1989 that tested captured Western ammunition types against BMP armor configurations. The document is partially declassified and available through the Parallel History Project on NATO-Warsaw Pact relations. The study confirmed that 25mm APFSDS rounds defeated infantry fighting vehicles. The phrasing is diplomatic. What it means is their BMPs exploded and their crews died, and the vehicles they'd been trained to fight weren't performing according to the threat assessments they'd been given. Soviet archives. The National Archives has some Gulf War records, but not the specific Bradley engagement debriefs. I want histories from Desert Storm veterans. Most focus on battalion-level operations rather than individual crew experiences. What I found instead were unit after treat Bradley crews as interchangeable components of mechanized infantry operations. That's how military documentation works. The institution cares about unit effectiveness. Individual experiences get compressed into statistics. A few crew members gave interviews to military publications in 1991 and 1992. Army Times, Armor Magazine. The interviews are short, generic. The gunners describe target acquisition and firing procedures. The commanders talk about tactical positioning. Nobody discusses what it felt like to watch a BMP explode at 1,800 meters or what happened to the crews inside those vehicles. Maybe the interviewers didn't ask. Maybe the crews didn't want to talk about it. I found one gunner identified only as Specialist K in a redacted declassified report who describes firing on an Iraqi BMP that was already abandoned. The crew had bailed out before his Bradley achieved a firing solution. He engaged the vehicle anyway because the ROE permitted destruction of enemy equipment. The BMP burned. That's the level of detail available in most documents. The best source I found was a platoon leader who wrote about his experiences in a military professional journal in 1995. He commanded 4 Bradleys during the ground campaign. his article focuses on leadership challenges and decision-making under fire. One paragraph mentions his gunners achieving 5 confirmed kills in 2 days. He doesn't name the gunners. He doesn't describe the engagements in detail. He mentions that some kills occurred at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters and that his crews expressed surprise at how quickly Iraqi vehicles were destroyed. That's it. The people who actually aimed the guns and pulled the triggers and watched the results through thermal sights, their detailed accounts either weren't recorded or aren't available, or were considered insufficiently important to preserve in accessible archives. The institutional record shows Bradley effectiveness through statistics. Over 100 BMP kills, minimal American casualties from BMP fire, validation of the weapon system. But the human details, what individual crew members saw, thought, felt, learned, that information is mostly gone or hidden behind classification walls or was never properly collected in the first place. Some of those crew members are probably still alive. They'd be in their 50s now. Maybe some of them would talk if someone asked. I didn't track them down. That's a different kind of research project, and I'm not sure they'd want to be found. The gun camera footage exists. The kill confirmations exist. The crews who made it happen exist somewhere in the statistics. The Soviet field manual I found from 1992, officially titled Threat Assessment NATO Mechanized Forces, still lists the M2 Bradley under mobility specifications first. Maximum road speed 66 km per hour. Cross-country speed 40 km per hour. Range 483 km. Crew capacity 3+6 dismounts. The weapon systems get 2 paragraphs. The 25mm M242 cannon is mentioned with effective range against light armor listed as 2,000 meters. The Tau missile system receives more detailed coverage than the gun. The lethality assessment section runs 4 sentences. It notes that the Bradley demonstrated higher than anticipated effectiveness against armored vehicles in Desert Storm. It recommends avoiding engagement at ranges beyond 1,200 meters. It suggests prioritizing Bradley destruction with tank fire or anti-tank missiles rather than engaging with BMP cannons. Then it moves on to other NATO vehicle types. That's the institutional reform. 4 sentences acknowledging that previous assessments were insufficient. No analysis of why the assessments were wrong. No discussion of doctrinal changes needed to counter the actual threat. Just revised engagement recommendations and a move to the next section. I found similar patterns in Russian military publications through the mid-1990s. Occasional mentions of Bradley performance in Desert Storm. Brief notes about 25mm autocannon effectiveness. But the fundamental doctrinal framework, the classification of infantry fighting vehicles as supporting elements rather than primary threats, remained largely unchanged in the documents I could access. Part of this was timing. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. The Russian Federation inherited a military in organizational chaos, equipment shortages, personnel cuts, budget collapse. Revising threat assessments and rewriting field manuals ranked low on the priority list when units couldn't afford fuel for training exercises. Another part was doctrinal inertia. Soviet military theory had spent decades developing operational concepts based on specific assumptions about how mechanized warfare worked. Those assumptions emphasized mass, speed, and overwhelming force. American combined arms doctrine worked differently. Smaller units with superior technology and training achieving disproportionate effects. The Gulf War demonstrated that approach worked, but acknowledging it fully would have required rethinking fundamental aspects of how the Soviet military understood modern combat. The Russian military eventually adapted. By the 2000s, their threat assessments and training materials reflected more sophisticated understanding of Western IFI capabilities. But that adaptation took years. The soldiers and crews who needed updated doctrine in 1991 and 1992 didn't get it. The designation never formally changed because there was no designation. Taxi wasn't official nomenclature. It was instructor shorthand. a way to quickly communicate to students what the vehicle was supposed to do on the battlefield, transport troops. That shorthand stopped appearing in the documents I found from the mid-1990s onward. But I don't know if that's because the assessment changed or because the instructors who used that language retired and were replaced by people who'd studied Desert Storm. The Iraqi military kept using Soviet doctrine through 2003. American forces encountered BMPs again during